Okay, we're gonna have to see how long I hang in there. My little stand's falling apart. I need to make a better one. But this next video is about how xylem functions. Xylem are specialized cells within the stem of the plant that transport water. And so xylem isn't really the name of a particular cell. Xylem is a tissue. And so that means that it includes multiple cell types. Included in xylem can be tracheids, which are the most narrow of the types of cells that move water. It could also be vessels, vessel elements. They also move water, but they're much more wide. And it also can include parenchyma, which again, remember, are just those like soft, pretty standard issue, round looking cells. And so xylem includes at least 3 different cell types, and they all work in moving water up the stem of the plant. So water can move up the stem of the plant with 3 different processes kind of all working at the same time. The first is root pressure. And root pressure is positive pressure that is going to come from the roots. Okay, so that just means that you have the buildup of pressure down here within the roots, and that pressure that becomes positive is pushing some water up the stem of the plant. This does work, and one way to imagine it is if you put a straw into a glass of water, you'll see the water just kind of barely creep its way up the straw towards just above the water line inside of the glass. Well, that's because there's positive pressure that's building down here underneath the water line because the water wants to attach to each other. It has cohesion. And so all the water is piling on each other and it's able to kind of creep up a little bit. And so that creeping up is positive pressure. It's coming from the roots, but it's pretty weak. And it's only going to work over short distances. So root pressure can be effective in moving water up to like the tip of a moss. Or maybe if it's really, really strong, could maybe get it to the top of a blade of grass. But it's not nearly enough pressure to move water up the length of like a tree, for example. The next way that we're going to move water up the plant is with transpiration. And this is the primary way in which that's going to happen. And so what's happening with transpiration is that you've got water that is down here in the soil. Well, all the water that is down here in the soil is attached to other water molecules because water makes hydrogen bonds with other water. And so all of the water that is down here in the soil is not isolated. It's kind of like this network of all of these attached little molecules of water that run in between all of the little particles of soil down here beneath the tree. Well, the water is going to be drawn into the roots because each of those water molecules are attached to water that is also extending into the tree. So you might ask, well, and how did the water get there in the first place? And it's just going to be from the tree growing. Initially, it was a little bitty tree, and when it was little, it had some water inside of it, and that same kind of column of water has always been there its whole life. And so it just keeps building. And so we've got this column of water that goes all the way up the trunk of the tree through the cells of the xylem until we eventually get up at the leaves. Well, the leaves have got, okay, here's my leaf. And my leaf has got openings in the bottom. And these are called stomata. And water can leave out of those stomata. So coming out of those stomata are going to be little molecules of water that are evaporating. Well, as they evaporate and move off into the atmosphere, they are attached to all these other water molecules. And so every time that one leaves out of that stomata, this one's leaves, everybody's going to ratchet up one position. The next one leaves, everybody ratchets up one position. And it's this constant like tick, 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 ratcheting up of all those individual water molecules until they all are evaporating out of the bottom of these leaves. So what's holding all of these together is cohesion. And so that's why all of this water doesn't just fall back down the tree at any time, is because they're all stuck to one another. And cohesion is also what is causing them to kind of ratchet themselves upwards as ones are replaced. But the reason why you have this pulling force on those individual molecules of water is because of evaporation of water out of the bottom of the leaves. And so this evaporation at the leaves is what we refer to as transpiration. And so transpiration is the evaporation of water from stomata in leaves. And it is going to pull water up the xylem with cohesion. And so the reason why I'm pointing out that it's pulling is because root pressure is like pushing. Root pressure is positive pressure. We're like pushing that water up there. And that works a little bit, but that's not going to work over very long distances. If you want to move water a very long distance, you're going to have to pull it. And that pulling force is coming from the cohesive forces between all these water molecules as they evaporate out of those leaves. And so once this process begins, this seems like, oh, well, you're talking about individual molecules of water. We got to move tons up this tree. And it's just because as this continues, it's going to like exponentially increase on itself because there's a force of that one to that one, but then that one to that one, and that one to that one, and that one to that one. And so the force increases as you increase the number of water molecules that you're talking about. Also, because these water molecules are closer to this area of evaporation than these, the pressure becomes more and more negative. And so up at the top of the tree, you could be looking at something like negative 100 atmospheres. And then down here at the middle, maybe you're at something like negative 50 atmospheres. Negative 10. And finally down here at the roots, it's not very negative at all. It could be just like negative 1 atmosphere. And so it's not that it's very strong down here, only negative 1 atmosphere, but it doesn't have to be very strong. It's just enough to kind of get them started on this whole process. And so this figure from your notes I feel like is the most informative, kind of summarizing all of that. But it's talking about that difference in pressure as you go up. It talks about how cohesion and adhesion is important. Cohesion is drawing each water molecule to the next one so that they move up the tree. And adhesion of the water molecules to those individual cells of the xylem keeps them from falling back down to the bottom as you're working through the whole process. Guard cells are what we call the cells that monitor the openings in the bottom of the leaf. And so the guard cells could close and they'll stop transpiration, which will stop the movement of water, or they can open wider, cause more evaporation, which will increase the amount of transpiration and the movement of water. And so this is ultimately solar powered. Once the water starts moving, you have so many water molecules that are moving at the same time that the cohesive forces become enormous. And so the water is going to keep moving up. And since the whole thing runs on the evaporation of water, that's why we say it's solar powered. The sun is what's causing that water to evaporate out of those little stomata.